So, Kyle, you are a member of the Carnivore Certification United course, and you had some questions about the Randle cycle course in particular, if I'm remembering correctly, right?
Sort of. I do want to touch on the Randle cycle, but a couple relating to muscle glycolysis and a couple other little bits.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So, any questions that you have, I'm here to answer to the best of my abilities here. So,
Yep, awesome. So, with muscle glycolysis, I'm confused as to why muscle cells in particular need to use glucose as the substrate and why they can't use ketones like a lot of other cells in us.
okay. So, that is actually a really good question, and it taps into a topic, muscle energetics, which is one of my favorite topics to delve into. It's one of my favorite concepts in the body. However, since it's one of my favorites, you can sort of guarantee that it is a little bit complicated because I like the complicated stuff. So I'm going to try and simplify it as much as possible. So the thing about muscles is they're the most rich in mitochondria out of any other cell. So for example, just for some comparison here, muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells, so our forearms, our biceps, all those,
Yep.
they have on average about 5,000 mitochondria in them, as opposed to a few hundred like fat cells. The heart has about 8,000 per cell. So since they have mitochondria in them, they can oxidize ketones and fatty acids and or pyruvate for ATP production. So they can use ketones and they can use fatty acids. However, usually people still insist on saying, which is, and for good reason, because it's true, that muscle cells, in order to fire, need glucose. Now that's true. Now let me try and break this down as concisely as possible. So basically, in order for a muscle fiber to twitch, it needs glycogen. And the reason for that is because the process of breaking down glycogen, glycogenolysis, is the only method by which muscle cells can produce enough ATP within a small enough amount of time for a contraction to occur. It's also the most efficient way of doing it because glycolysis itself, as opposed to glycogenolysis, the breakdown of glycogen, requires an additional ATP to start the process. So glycogenolysis, the breakdown of glycogen, requires one less. So each polymer of glycogen that's broken down in a muscle cell produces lots of ATP that is immediately used to produce a twitch. Now, in order to fully explain this in the best way possible is to just continue explaining how the glycogen is replenished. So think of a muscle cell filled with glycogen. You're about to go and twitch that muscle fiber because you're about to perform a workout, an exercise. And so a muscle fiber twitches, and glycogen effectively is fully depleted from that muscle cell. Well, the question then arises, how is that glycogen replenished? Well, that is where the mitochondria in the muscle cell come in. The energy required to synthesize glycogen again for the next muscle twitch involves ATP from, and really we should say energy, from the mitochondria. So that's what oftentimes is referred to as the aerobic system, is the mitochondria producing ATP. You may have also heard of people talking about anaerobic exercises.
Yeah, and they're actually the same thing. Yeah.
Right, so they're occurring at the same time. So
Yeah.
so the anaerobic system is glycogenolysis, the breakdown of glycogen, and that's what produces the ATP for a muscle twitch.
Yep.
The aerobic system, oxidative phosphorylation is the full name, is the process by which the mitochondria produce ATP. There's an intermediate system, which is the third system, and that's called PCR, which is phosphocreatine. So that is the system by which PCR, creatine really, comes over to the mitochondria, takes energy that's synthesized by the mitochondria, and takes it back over to the cell fluid for glycogen resynthesis, and then the process continues. So glycogen gets
Oh,
resynthesized
yeah.
for the
I
next
thought
muscle
it was
twitch.
it was the donation of the phosphate group to turn the ADP back into ATP.
Effectively, yes. The reason that I'm using the word energy, though, is because the process involves the mitochondria producing energy, and creatine comes over with a phosphate group from the cell fluid as well, and
Yep.
uses the energy that's created by the mitochondria to synthesize PCR. So they put them together. Then PCR goes back to the cell fluid and brings it to an ADP molecule, like you were just saying, then breaks apart, and the phosphate group goes over to ATP, forms, or ADP goes and forms ATP, and then that ATP is exclusively used to resynthesize glycogen.
Okay. So on that, I don't know, I might have missed a step, but when we're talking about the extreme amount of energy required for a muscle cell to move, w- how does that relate to the fact that ketones have a higher yield of ATP compared to the oxidation of glucose?
Yeah, so the reason that the a muscle cell still cannot use ATP supplied by oxidative phosphorylation, despite the fact that, ketones can provide lots of ATP, is because it's not exactly about the quantity, it's about the amount of time it takes for transport. So oxidative phosphorylation produces ATP, but the process by which it has to export the ATP, if that were actually the case, would be too inefficient for the body. And the reason for that is because of the fact that ATP has a very low concentration gradient because purines are all over the cell. So you can imagine if you have, what's a good example of this? If you have an empty space and, like, think of a room and there's a wall separating uh, there's a wall that's in the middle of the room and it separates it into two spaces. And in one space you got it packed full of a substance, and in the other space there's nothing. If you let that wall go, the speed at which it's going to fall into the next empty space is a lot faster than if you had a very little amount of that substance in the wall or on the other side of the wall and you remove the wall, or if you had a lot of the substance in both areas. So
Yeah.
yeah, so there's a lot of ATP all over the cell. So the export process from the mitochondria to the other part of the cell that glycogen is involved in is a lot slower than creatine's is, because creatine is only in one part of the cell. So creatine is very efficient. Also, the fact that creatine is a lot smaller, so it can move faster as well. The ATP and ADP molecules are very large molecules comparatively to things like creatine. So creatine is very that this is the entire reason why people consider creatine as an ergogenic aid. It's something that enhances physical performance. This is why it's considered that. It's because creatine has a very critical role to play in the transfer of energy in muscle cells.
Real quick on that, do you believe it would be contraindicated the consumption of standard creatine monohydrate due to the water retention it has?
That is something I haven't looked particularly into. I don't think that there's any worry about it unless you took an exorbitant amount of it. But then you'd have to consider how efficiently the body excretes any excess, because that also has an effect. So, I mean, as much as it is true that the more creatine you have in a cell, you can have, I don't know, edema happening, theoretically. That depends on how much of the consumption, how much creatine that you consume is actually utilized instead of excreted. So
Yep.
that's something that I don't know the answer to that much. You'd have to look at either case studies or actual, well, really case studies of people taking enough creatine to cause, edema or something like that. And I don't think there's any that really exist. Um, in terms of something related to that, yes, creatine, of course, it will cause the body to retain more water, particularly muscles, maybe a little bit the brain, which could possibly be where the concern arises because creatine is also in the brain. It's involved in the brain via the same processes, actually.
Yeah.
But do I think that if you took, even if you're sticking to the serving size, let's just put it that way, if you're not being like irresponsible with it, I don't think you're going to have any problem. And your muscles will probably look better because they'll be more plump. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So on top of that, so I'm sort of coming at this from sort of a lot of a gym like gym bro kind of situation, because that's the sort of people I'm surrounded by and the sort of people I'm generally promoting carnivore to. That's my immediate area. So one of the biggest things that comes up is fat loss, and generally past your body's natural set point of fat loss. So if we're talking about sort of wanting to utilize your fat more efficiently and get it off your body, obviously we've got things that we can follow, like the 70 to 30 ratio of fat to protein. But if we're someone who has uh, excess energy expenditure, like you've got a really physical job, something like that, when we're looking at topping up what you need to consume, is going overboard on protein due to the glyconeogenic effect gonna halt your progress versus if you were to consume more fat?
Potentially. Usually what I say is the number one rule is to stick to your satiety and hunger signaling. But we all know that we grew up eating a diet that seems to have really skewed those messages and those signals. It seems to be the case that they can be, returned. They can return, but it might take some time. So for people that think that that might be the case for them, I think really no matter what your energy expenditure is, so to speak, no matter how taxing your job is, the number one metric rule that I sort of recommend and suggest following if your hunger signaling seems to be inadequate is 1.75 grams per kilogram of lean body mass. And the lean body mass can be pretty roughly calculated by taking your height in meters squared and multiplying it by what's considered to be the optimal BMI. And people know my opinions on the BMI, but that's why, yeah. But that's why I say rough estimate, and then that will yield your lean body mass rough estimate in kilograms. However, that number that you get, whatever gram of protein that you yield from that calculation, can be up to 1.5 times that amount, depending on your energy expenditure. So if you believe that you're one of these people, I would not go past that. So that's usually what I say. Now, can people misperceive their necessity to follow that rule to that extent? Obviously. This actually happens a lot in a demographic of people that, particularly the demographic that is hyperfixated on developing as much muscle mass as possible. I'm not going to say that I never had one of those moments before. This is particularly in the men group. This happens a lot. It can happen if people are trying to lose fat and they see some stagnation with that, and they're following the 1.5 times that number. I would try and go back down to the regular formula, the 1.75 grams per kilogram of lean body mass. And I want to put a message out there that I think people overestimate how much protein is necessary for muscle building.
Yeah, 100%. Exactly like where I'm coming from with this.
Yeah, and it's something that I've noticed in myself, that I actually seem to require a lot less protein than I would have thought to build the same amount of muscle. And it seems to be because we have been taught all of our lives that all protein, irrespective of the source, is the same. And if you're taught that, then you can focus a lot on getting a lot of plant protein and you won't see as much gain in muscle mass.
Like lectins and molecules like that.
Exactly. And so, of course, if you're eating all those, then yeah, you might think that you need 300 grams of protein in a day to gain muscle. However, if you're eating all of your protein from animal sources, different story. I also want to add a second note that if people are really concerned about muscle mass, try and wean away from your concern about muscle mass to strength output, because those two are not necessarily intertwined. And the reason I say that is a lot of people, if they go on a carnivore diet, they might see muscle mass decrease because of water weight. So water retention will start to go away, but your strength, that doesn't affect your strength. And they'll also see a lot of fat being utilized from their muscles, because we all know that you can have intramuscular fat. It's the entire reason why when we eat steak, there's fat in the steak. It's muscle meat. We have fat in our muscles as well, but you can get more fat in those muscles, and which will increase muscle mass if you eat a poor diet. So if people are really concerned about muscle mass, don't be as concerned about muscle mass unless you're having a decrease in muscle mass and that's corresponding to a decrease in in physical strength output. Yeah.
Yeah. So on that, with our protein requirements, really it's just to the point of amino acid saturation and a positive nitrogen balance, isn't it? There's
Yes.
not much past that. So once we've hit that, your daily requirement, that's sorted. They're really the only two precursors in that. So with that, with the protein gluconeogenic effect, does that occur once we've hit amino acid saturation?
So that's actually usually yes. However, it depends on other things as well, particularly glucagon secretion. And really what we're talking about is I to G ratio. So the reason I say typically is because you'll almost see a directly commensurate relationship between protein ingestion and glucagon secretion. So typically, you're going to see that corresponding. But on a technical basis, and maybe it's just the pedant in me, it's not just amino acid saturation. It's particularly the hormonal responses that are yielded from protein ingestion, protein and fat particularly. So if you eat a lot of protein, you will not only secrete insulin directly at the level of beta cells, but you'll actually secrete more glucagon, way more glucagon than insulin, proportionally or comparatively speaking. And the glucagon will stimulate the liver to create more glucose, even if amino acids were not, let's say, to their saturation point. If you inject glucagon into someone, for example, that isn't eating any protein, they're still going to have an upregulation of gluconeogenesis inactivity. But in people that are with respect to just eating food, yes, if you eat protein and you eat fat, once you reach that threshold of amino acid saturation, those amino acids will then go and be used for glucose production because you'll have enough glucagon there. You won't have a lot of insulin that's suppressing that at all because insulin has the counteracting effect. And yeah, you'll produce plenty of glucose to get a sufficient insulin response, actually. So it's this interesting little feedback thing where you eat protein, it secretes glucagon and insulin. The glucagon stimulates the liver to produce more glucose using the amino acids that you've just consumed and broken down. And then that glucose that's produced stimulates the liver to produce more insulin. If that makes sense. So it's a little feedback effect to a point, or else you'll shut down gluconeogenesis to some extent, not completely. So yeah, that's what happens. Sorry if I complicated that a little bit. Sometimes I get a little tangential on that.
That's good. That's the exact level that I want.
Okay.
So with that one, I think we can segue from the hormonal part to insulin. So obviously insulin sensitivity, it's a construct. It's not actually what's going on. We're looking at the bigger picture of the Randle cycle. So in the case of a type 2 diabetic, when we're looking at insulin, if the Randle cycle is active and the cells are oversaturated with glucose, how does adding exogenous insulin then allow for more glucose to get into the cell?
Yeah, so basically the way that I put it is that everything in the body is a chemical equilibrium. So according to Le Chatelier's principle, if you have enough of something, if you put enough of something into an equilibrium, and think of an equilibrium as a formula, like A plus B goes to form C plus D, double-sided arrow, so it's a backwards and forwards reaction. That's what an equilibrium is. Imagine you pour a lot of A into the solution, a lot of A. What you'll actually get is a change if you add enough A in, but not exactly in the concentration of A. You get a decrease in the concentration of B, increase the concentrations of C and D. That's kind of what you get. But think of insulin as A, and think of glucose as B. So you pour a lot of insulin into the body, you'll eventually get an effect on decreasing B out of the bloodstream, for example. You'll push it into cells. So that's the main reason that happens. Because you got to think, when you talk about the Randle cycle being activated, to simplify, what you're talking about is inhibition of enzymes, chemical inhibitions of enzymes. But if that's the case, then you can outweigh that chemical pressure with another one. You just have to get enough of it in there. It doesn't seem to be the case that the amount of insulin that is secreted by the pancreas in an insulin-resistant scenario is sufficient, or else you would get the glucose in. And there's reasons for that. There's speculated reasons that I have, but there's also absolutely established reasons. One of the absolutely established reasons is actually the sheer size of fat cells can reach a maximum level, to the point where no matter what the chemical pressure is, it's not going to take that glucose in, because if it does, it will die because of maximum hypertrophy. That's one cause of insulin resistance, actually. But another, in the case of the Randle cycle, seems to be the more you do that and the more your cells continue to divide and the more that the telomeres shorten, you're going to get a situation where the cells will refuse glucose. This is the speculation argument, because this hasn't actually been absolutely proven. But it does seem to happen where eventually the cells just quit accepting the glucose, because it takes less and less glucose for it to be lethal of a dose. The more and more you do that, and the more that the cells divide and divide. And so you get a situation where it's extremely dangerous at that point. You get bona fide, like type 2 diabetes, extreme uncontrolled diabetes. You'll get to a point where it's like type 1.5 diabetes, I think it's called, where you're type 2 diabetic, but you still have to inject insulin. And it trends towards type 1 diabetes eventually. It gets to a really bad situation. So that's why insulin, if you inject enough of it, it can force it in, but you're not doing your cells any favor when you do that at all. So
Yeah. So with the precursor to type 2 diabetes occurring, is it more so the banning of glucose entering new cells, or is it the inability to produce enough insulin to transport that glucose?
I think so. This brings up an interesting discussion about causality in the first place, because a lot of people have actually asked me this question. They've said, well, if the mixture of fat and glucose can lead to a hyperglycemic event, why do you say that glucose is the problem, when in reality, if you removed the fat, it would ameliorate the problem, and if you removed the glucose, it would be the problem? If you want to talk about a causal inference, you would say it's the mixture of both of them that's the cause, not glucose. And it's a good question. So it's a very similar one. What would you actually consider it to be? What I would consider it to be is, since we operate under the philosophy that the human body, let's back up a little bit. The Western medicine view for the last century or so, a little over that, has been that the human body is inherently flawed. Oh, you're inflamed. Your body shouldn't be inflamed. Let's give you an anti-inflammatory medication, whether it be a steroid, whether it be an NSAID, whatever. We operate under the exact opposite viewpoint. Our genes have evolved, at least in our speciation, for 4.5 million years. They have had enough experience to understand how to withstand externalities. They know how to act, And so given that philosophical standard, you must look at the situation and go, okay, well, what is the problem here? Your body secreting insulin to try and withstand a glucose load that is insufficient is not the fault of the body. The genes are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. What is there that the body did not put there? Well, it's the glucose. We believe that externalities are basically the cause of disease, whether it be environmental toxins like air pollution, whether it be glyphosate sprayed on plants, or whether it be a bunch of unnecessary and toxic, if it reaches enough of a threshold, glucose coming into the body and then subsequently into the bloodstream. So when people ask me that question, or something similar to that, like I was just alluding to, I would say that the thing that is introduced into the body that is unnecessary and to a certain degree toxic, if it hits a certain threshold, depending on who you are, that threshold is up or is more or less. That's the cause of the disease process. So in this case, it would be the glucose in the bloodstream, and it would be especially the mixture of that, the interactions of that glucose with the fat within a cell. And further to that, actually, when you talk about diabetes, once again, like I just said earlier, you do this more and more where you store more and more fat, you're going to get an insulin resistant scenario there as well, because the fat cells physically cannot absorb any more glucose. Any more mass at all, actually. So those factors right there are the problem. It's not the cells refusing the glucose. It's not the beta cells not able to produce sufficient insulin to get the glucose into the cells in the first place. It's actually the consumption of the toxin, the thing that's unnecessary for our physiology as human beings. Yeah.
Yeah, sick. So with that, I think it sort of segues into another one. When we're looking at the build-up of atherosclerotic plaque, obviously we know that's due to inflammation in the arteries, causing those high pressure systems occurring. That's what causes the calcified lesions. When we look at glucose as a precursor inflammatory product to that occurring, what's actually at play that causes a significant increase in blood flow? Like if we look at the increase of the inorganic phosphate occurring due to the Randle cycle problems, and then the addition from that we get the added cytokines and essentially things trying to fix things. What is it that's actually increasing the blood flow? Is it a decrease in the size of the arteries, or is it an increase of fluid due to external factors coming in to that location, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think, are you referring to the areas where the atherosclerotic plaque tends to build up the most, the areas where turbulent flow occurs the most?
Yeah, like what is causing that increase in blood pressure that then causes that?
Ah, okay. Yeah. So it's actually something that is not directly involved at the level of the arteries, at least the main vasculature. So let me explain. When you consume inflammatory compounds of any kind, but in this case you're talking about glucose, it causes glycation to all of your tissues to some extent. And when you are inflamed, since that glycation causes inflammation, what happens is you have vasodilation, so that actually the blood vessels get bigger in areas like fingers, feet, the peripheral areas. But as a result of that, in order to get vasodilation there, in order to supply more blood to the area, which is designed to supply more white blood cells, macrophages, and what's the other one? Cytokines to the area, you need vasoconstriction in the major areas. So it constricts the arteries here to get more blood regularly provided to the peripheral areas. So it's more of a peripheral cause than it is a direct cause. So your high blood pressure is hypertension is basically invariably associated with inflammation. And I believe that there's multiple reasons for that. I think X is causing Y and Y is causing X in that situation. Feedback loop sort of thing. But I think the initial cause of the hypertension is inflammation itself for that reason. If you have a lot of peripheral inflammation because you're consuming a lot of inflammatory compounds, like enough glucose to cause that much inflammation, then you're going to get a situation where you got a lot of blood flow coming to the peripheral areas as a result of vasoconstriction happening at the central areas, which will, of course, vasoconstriction in the major arteries will cause hypertension to some extent.
Yeah. And then that's generally the locations where we see atherosclerotic plaque form.
Yeah, well, I mean, so there's vasoconstriction in the entire central system, but that as a result will cause more plaque buildup in the turbulent areas where the bifurcations are, because that will cause more force and the blood lingers around there longer. Yeah.
Yes. So the vasodilation effect in our peripheral areas, sorry, you might have touched on it, it's just gone over my head. What causes vasodilation in that situation?
Yeah, so whenever you undergo, like let's say your hand is injured for some reason. So let's say you ate a lot of glucose and you have a lot of peripheral inflammation in all of your body. Most of the time you can't see it on the superficial level. It's internal. You know, you've got pain in your joints or something like that. Let's take your hand, for example. You have inflammation in your hand and your hand gets all red. Some people actually have this as Raynaud syndrome. You may have heard of it before. The reason that vasodilation occurs there is because when you dilate a blood vessel and more blood flow gets there, that allows for the flow of more cytokines, more macrophages than otherwise could happen if they were more constricted at their normal level when the area isn't inflamed. So it provides more healing elements to the area for it to heal faster and more effectively than if you didn't have that happening. Yeah.
And so that's sort of what injuries and swelling is.
Yes, swelling it functions as a splint. It basically stabilizes the area, especially if you've got, a swollen. It prevents movement in the area so that so you don't further injure it.
So if you've got a swollen ankle, it's essentially the vasodilation in order to get healing molecules and whatnot to that space, and that's why it's inflamed, that's vasodilated. There can be more in that space to help.
Effectively, yeah.
So then,
Yeah.
And then because of that, we've got the constriction in the rest of our body in order to push the blood to those locations harder.
Yes, exactly.
Therefore, causing the lesions to occur on its way to that place.
Yes. Yeah, so one more note, and you might already be implying this, but I just want to make sure. Those plaques, yes, hypertension, at least to some extent, because you can think of hypertension as a spectrum, as instead of like, you're not hypertensive, and then you are. It's a spectrum. You'll be at least a little hypertensive to push that blood into areas like your hands or wherever you've got that peripheral inflammation. And that, as a result, since your central vascular system, so to speak, is vasoconstricted, then you'll have the plaque building up in the areas that have those bifurcations, because of the excess turbulent flow. So it's a side effect, basically. The thing I always try and tell people, because it sort of seems intuitive that this would be the case, but it's actually not the case at all, is that the areas of the vascular system that experience high shear stress, which is just the abrasive shearing force, are the areas that are the least likely to develop atherosclerotic lesions. It's the areas that have that turbulent flow where there's eddying and pools of blood that happen that are exacerbated by hypertension that develop the most plaque. So those areas, as a result of peripheral inflammation, chronic peripheral inflammation, because it's got to be chronic, those are the areas that develop the plaque. It's not the areas like, I don't know, your other peripheral arteries that are developing that plaque. Even in those situations, because shear stress doesn't really do a lot of irremediable damage, so to speak. Yeah.
Okay. So with that, sort of touching on, it's sort of unrelated, but it is. When we're looking at statins and how they can potentially disrupt a lot of hormonal cycles in your body, and such as the disruption of producing CoQ10, if someone takes exogenous coenzyme Q10, like orally, is that simply digested as amino acids in the body? Like, you're not going to actually absorb coenzyme Q10?
Yeah, well, that's interesting, because CoQ10 is the only enzyme in the electron transport chain that isn't even consistent. It's not consisted of protein at all. It's the only one. So it's actually not broken down into any amino acids. I'd have to look at how it's metabolized. I believe that it's metabolized pretty consistently. At the very least, it seems to be resynthesized into CoQ10. You give the body what it needs to synthesize CoQ10. At the end of the day, instead of telling someone to supplement with CoQ10, you got to get them off that statin. And I'm sure that you agree as well. I'm not saying you don't agree. It's one of those things where a lot of people want to negotiate and bargain. And there's some situations where you just got to say, look, you can do this, but I can't guarantee that it's going to fix the issue. I mean, the destruction of your CoQ enzymes in the mitochondria is what causes the rhabdomyolysis that people have heard about, that the muscle wasting. And it's precisely because what cells in the body consist of the most mitochondria? Once again, it's the muscle cells. And so you will get muscle wasting because muscle cells will not be able to live without sufficient mitochondria. They can't. They are highly energy intensive cells. They will die without sufficient mitochondrial function. And so, especially considering you're trying to come at this approach from a fitness perspective and a muscle building perspective, the last thing that you want to be doing is or the last thing that you want to have is clients on statins in that regard. Then it's really, really bad. Yeah. So.
Yeah. So one more major question. That's right. When we're looking at the inflammatory effect of consuming food in general, I know we've got that base effect where anything that goes in, we have that inflammation. This could be the soil that has bacteria or something growing on it that we shouldn't be consuming. When we're looking at that effect, it's hard to explain, but if we're having like a lot of carnivores have coffee with butter, that sort of thing. If we're regularly ingesting something that's not water, like a drink or beverage of some kind, is that inflammatory effect at play the entire time that's being consumed?
That's a good question. It's pretty quick for it to happen. It happens within a matter of seconds, actually. And actually, the reason that we know that is because if you look at people that have genuine anaphylaxis, so you take an extreme end of the spectrum, people that have anaphylaxis, if they ingest something that inflames them and that they're allergic to, it hits them very quickly, right? Well, it's the same thing with us, except we just don't go into anaphylaxis. So as soon as you start eating something, water, I think, is a different story. It's really when we're eating foods, as opposed to drinking things. However, if you drink something that stimulates the production of acid, or really acidic fluid in the stomach, then you're same thing then. But with water, unless you've got really inflammatory stuff in the water, which is really up for debate, actually. I mean, or actually not up for debate in a way. It's there are some very not great things in there. Then not really as much of an issue. But I get your point. If they ingest anything, is it happening all throughout the consumption process? It's very quick. So I mean, when it hits your mouth, maybe not. But as soon as it goes down your throat and it stimulates and it hits your stomach, there are receptors in your stomach that respond to substance. What's the word I'm looking for? Contact. And so as soon as it starts, the reason that we're very confident in saying that any food, no matter what it's made of, causes inflammation, plus or minus, of course, if it's an actively harmful food, it's going to cause more, is because if you actually look at one of the ways in which the stomach produces fluid, there's H2 receptors, they're histamine receptors. You may have heard of H2 blockers, acid reflux medications. Maybe not. I think I was on one. One of them is famotidine, I believe. That gives you an inference right there because histamine is involved in the inflammatory process. And you've got H2 blockers, or you've got H2 receptors in the stomach that stimulate the production of acid. And those are activated no matter what you eat, no matter what is eaten or ingested. Besides, once again, water, maybe. Maybe water has an effect on increasing stomach fluid to counteract its alkalinizing effects because it's neutral. So you might dilute the stomach fluid, but you want to talk about very low-grade inflammation, it's going to be when you drink water, right? But anyway, yeah, so in terms of how long it's going, in terms of how long it lasts, you didn't exactly ask that, but you're talking about how long, you're sort of asking it, I think. 3-4 hours, max. So it's not a long time, and it's going to be a lot less time and a lot less significant when you eat a species-appropriate diet that isn't replete and teeming with a bunch of lectins and oxalic acid and stuff like that. But, for the most part, if you want to go to absolute, how long is it going to take you to get back to baseline maximum? I think 4 hours maximum. So
I think just to elaborate on that real quick. So if you were to have something I'm not saying that you should be drinking liquids all day that have butter in them or milk or something like that. But if you were to have a coffee or something that had milk in it or something like that, for the time that you're consuming that item, that inflammatory effect is going to be continuous, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. It's going to keep popping back up. So say you drank something an hour ago and then you have more of that thing an hour later, you're reigniting that inflammatory process.
Yes, absolutely. I've actually, I can attest to this myself because I'm someone that still suffers with an inflammatory condition, so I have to be pretty careful with when I eat. If I eat something, and it's gotten a lot better as of very recently, but if I eat something, it will cause some inflammation, and I recognize it immediately. However, if I eat something 2 hours later, it'll go right back to where it was when I ate the first meal. I feel it every single time. And I've done, and I know, like, I've tried to be like, okay, well, let's control this little N of 1 experiment, quote unquote, as much as possible, by removing. I wasn't searing my steaks anymore. I was like, oh, there's some AGEs on there, advanced glycation end products. So let's get rid of like all of those. Let's make it to where it's like the most pure, non-inflammatory steak possible. Grass-fed, grass-finished meat, no advanced glycation end products in it, as rare as I can eat it, and it still happens. So, it's just, it's one of the reasons why we promote, OMAD, if you can do it. If you're someone that's like really into bodybuilding, 2 meals a day, if not 3, may be appropriate. So,
yeah, I think that's reasonable. Sticking to 2 or 1, it's really not that hard once your satiety signaling's in check.
Yep.
Sorry, I said that was the last question, but I've kind of got a little tiny follow-up.
Yeah, that's fine. It's fine. Yeah.
With glycation. So I feel like a popular topic that's been popping up a bit is the potential to have an elevated HbA1c on carnivore.
Yes.
When we're looking at that, I feel like the theory that elevated lifespans of red blood cells, that seems a bit strange. I don't know if it's just me, but is it more likely, and that's not coming from like a scientist's opinion, I'm just saying for me that it's weird to comprehend. Is it also possible that due to but the Randle cycle really holding glucose out on the carnivore diet, could it be due to just a little less uptake of glucose, causing more of it in the bloodstream, therefore causing more glycated blood cells?
Yeah, that could also be the case. There's not one set reasoning that I can think of. The main one that is cited is what you just said, which was the length of life in red blood cells, which, from my understanding, there's not enough science yet to directly support that claim, that has directly proven that claim to be true. There's other inferences that we're making with already conducted science, like, for example, you can get your A1C lowered by consuming the same amount of glucose, but by consuming phytosterols.
Yeah.
And it seems to be the reason that seems to be the reason for this is because of the fact that phytosterols are incorporated into the structure of cell membranes because it looks very similar to cholesterol, and anything that isn't cholesterol that insinuates itself into the cell membranes will most likely cause that cell to be unstable, and the structure at least, and become very easily able to be ruptured or burst upon impact or something. And so it actually decreases the lifespan of the red blood cells. So we know that a decrease in the life of red blood cells can lower your HbA1c. So we make an inference from that says, well, if you don't consume things that kill a bunch of red blood cells, which we know that glucose does, which is why we measure an A1c in the first place, they would probably lead to an increase in it. And we also know it because when you take an A1C test on people and you compare it to their fructosamine assay, which measures, glycation of albumin and other proteins in their blood, it can come back completely normal. There's another test, reticulocyte production rate. So if you've got a normal one that isn't very upregulated, it tells you that, well, you're having far less red blood cells dying then. Because if you didn't, then you'd have an increase in that rate. So there's a lot of, it's basically like a proxy diagnosis. You have a bunch of these tests that you look at to make that inference. There's no direct proof of it, which is oftentimes what they'll say. They'll be like, well, there's no direct proof of that, so you're just making things up. It's wishful thinking. It's wish casting. And it's like, you can say that, but there's some pretty substantial inferences. But yes, what you just said, your suggestion could also be the case, because we know that there have been anecdotes. Actually, Paul Saladino is one of these people that whenever he was eating no carbohydrates, really to speak of, when he was on that strict carnivore diet, he actually had a higher fasting blood glucose level than he did when he introduced carbohydrates back in a very high amount. And I actually covered this before. And so he uses that as like if you eat a lot of sugar, then you'll get your fasting blood glucose down. I think that actually has to do with the fact that he has higher insulin. Insulin brings glucose down. He does often, show his fasting insulin too, though. And so it's like, well, maybe not. either way, we're talking about a very small absolute difference in glucose that he's talking about. And it's also dependent on when you get it tested. It fluctuates all throughout the day. Yeah. But yeah, no, I think that's a plausible reasoning. Absolutely. Yeah. But there's no real way to tell right now, you know.
Yeah. No, cool. Um, I think that's all my important questions. I think that's everything.
All right. Well, I hope that I answered them as best as I could in a way that was easily conceived. If you have any more, and this actually goes for any other clients in the course or anyone, and also any future ones, we can schedule more of these because I'm happy to answer the questions. I mean, I have, as you know, I have the 4 modules there, and even though it's 4 modules, there's a lot contained within them. And so it can be hard to, even with the quizzes, there could be some ancillary questions that people have, especially ones that are just really interested in the topics. So I like to be able to take the time and answer the questions. This stuff I didn't grasp the stuff instantaneously either. It took me years of looking at the stuff. So, but all right. If you have any more questions, feel free to schedule another call with me. I'll be happy to organize one. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
awesome. No, thanks heaps. I seriously appreciate it. It was really good.
Yeah. All right.